And today we are kicking off with the incredible Dr. Sonali McDermid, who is here to talk. Let me introduce her properly. She is a climate scientist and the Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU, and it is our absolute honor to have you here today. I am very excited to learn from you. And I'll just introduce myself. I'm Molly Braverman, she, her, director of the Broadway Green Alliance. We have a mission to educate, motivate, and inspire the entire theater community and its patrons to adopt environmentally friendlier practices. And we are all here and in for it today as we're going to learn so much about, as you heard, food. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Dr. McDermid. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat as we go. We will have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Molly and Chrissy. And I'm so excited to be here and to learn of the Broadway Green Alliance and all of this great work that you guys are doing and the commitments you all have made to a greener art. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm hoping you can see my talk now. If you nod, okay, that's great. And I'm going to put this into slideshow mode. Right, so as Molly mentioned, I am a climate scientist by training, and for the last 10 years or so, I've worked at the intersection of climate and agriculture and food security. And I'm kind of interested in reconciling two dimensions of this. So as you can see from my title slide, I've got climate impacts on and from our global food system, right? And so that's acknowledging that, we're all concerned about the impacts of climate change, which is here. We are now very grounded in an era of climatic change. We have been for a while, we will be and continue to be in the future. The degree to which, of course, is determined by us. And so we're very concerned about these impacts on the food system. And I think when we think about climate impacts on the food system, things come to mind like losses of water and drought and dry conditions. What you're looking at here in these images is sort of the flip side of this, right? In 2019, we actually had really record rainfall across the United States, which is what you're seeing in this map. The dark greens are areas where we saw above average or record rainfall amounts. This led to flooding, and what you're looking at here at the bottom are actually soybeans, a pile of soybeans that have been drenched because of the rainfall, and so the oils are getting expelled, it's rotting, and all of that heat from the decomposition can lead to combustion, and so we are literally underwater and burning at the same time in some cases. So the impacts of climate change on ag are many, which we'll talk about, and this is a cause for concern. We all think about food at least 3 times a day, if not more, if you're me. We all have a very personal relationship. Some of you may actually feel really strongly about food. And so it incites all of these emotions. Agriculture, however, is also a major contributor to climate change, to global environmental change. So, when you're looking at images like this, one of the questions that comes to my head is, well, how is climate change impacting food, but how also are our systems vulnerable? How do we make our agricultural systems, our food systems vulnerable to climate change? How do they create their own vulnerabilities? And so those are the types of themes that I want to explore with you today. And so when I think about climate and agriculture and the way we manage our landscapes, one question comes to mind, and that's for what, right? Why are we doing all of this? Why do we farm? And presumably, purportedly, one major goal of agriculture is food security, right? What we eat. And so the UN Food and Agriculture Organization defines food security as the availability of food. Are we growing enough? The economic and physical access to food. Can you buy food? Do you have access to markets? And then food utilization, right? Which is, okay, once you get the food, can you actually obtain the full complement of nutrients from that food? Do you have sanitation, safe drinking water to cook with, for example? And then, of course, overlying all of these is the stability of these three elements over time, right? And this kind of comprises our definition of food security. And so the first point to make with this is that food security is not just about production. It's not just about how much food we're making or producing, right? It's about a whole assortment of other things that climate change can impact. Now, food security is starting to lend itself to more spaces, right? We're starting to think about it in the context of other goals, and which is what you're looking at down here, other sustainable development goals, such as using food and agriculture, its intersection with minimizing poverty, with responsible production, with climate and biodiversity, both in the ocean and on land. And so this brings me to my second point. Above and beyond food security, we are increasingly asking more of our food system. It needs to serve multiple and urgent goals. Not only does it need to feed everybody, but we also know agriculture provides fiber and increasingly fuel. It's also a bottom line for some industries, right? The ag industry itself. And then we're asking it to serve as a form of climate mitigation. We're asking it to foster biodiversity. So how do we start to think about and evaluate and manage these trade-offs? Now, before we even talk about the impact and intersection with climate change, we need to, and if we're interrogating it through this lens of food security, right? Climate and ag through the lens of food security, one thing that just comes to light even before we talk about climate change is that we have an incredibly productive global agricultural system, more than enough calories that we're generating to feed everybody each day fairly well. And yet, despite these copious levels of food production, we are not meeting global food security needs, right? There is still a huge swath of the planet that experiences serious to alarming food security on a daily or seasonal basis. So despite our current levels of production, even irrespective of climate change, we're still not meeting our needs and targets. And so this kind of brings up this question too, again, even before we talk about climate change, of, well, how do we measure success of our global agricultural system? How do we measure our food security success? And what are we measuring in ag, if not food security, such that we can wind up with a picture that's so productive, but yet not serving everybody? And so I kind of think that this contrast of these two maps is quite indicative of some of the outstanding issues we're dealing with. So on the left-hand side, what you're seeing are what we call global yield gaps. And so anywhere in the green are areas that are coming pretty close to the maximum amount of food that can be produced, or crops that can be produced, right? So this is where crop production is meeting its potential, right? As we've closed the gap. And areas that are kind of in the red and orange are areas where crops, cereals in particular, are not meeting the potential they could. They're not producing as much as they could in those particular regions. And so when you look at the world like this, right, you kind of see this pattern emerging that industrialized areas of intensive agriculture, mostly at higher latitudes, and industrialized nations have their gaps mostly closed. They're meeting potential production. Whoops, sorry about that. And other areas that kind of map on to these areas of food insecurity are not meeting that potential production. There are significant gaps. Now, if you kind of burn this image into your head and then look at the image on the right, what you'll see is a slightly different measure. Here, we're looking at not how much is being produced, but how much food is directly feeding people, how much actually enters the supply chain and directly makes it to feed people. And when you look at this, right, the colors are reversed, you get this really interesting mirror image that the areas that are producing the most are not the areas where those calories are going to feed people directly. They're going to other end uses. In some cases, right, a third of crop calories, this is globally actually, go towards animal feed. About 10% is used for fuel and industry. And when you kind of slice and dice this, it's roughly only about half the crop calories that we're producing are actually feeding people. And where that actually makes it to people are in some of the areas that we deem food insecure, right? So this gives you a sense of vulnerability, right? Our highest producing regions, right, where we're seeing these soybeans light on fire, right? They may be important for industry purposes, but when you're measuring it from a food security perspective, right, what we have to kind of evaluate that contribution. So with that in the background of our minds, I want to talk about kind of three main important topics, I feel, topics that structure my own research, but I think are important for a range of, a range of uses, from stakeholders who are making decisions to us, we individuals as stakeholders. And that is, what are the impacts of climate change on food production and security? How does agriculture in turn contribute to global environmental change? Particularly when you start thinking about the way that agriculture is being, used, right? And then finally, right, what is the solution space, right? Where do we start to achieve food security for 9 to 10 billion people that also mitigates against these vulnerabilities? And so there's something in between, right? This Venn diagram, when we're thinking about climate impacts on ag and agricultural impacts on the environment, right? And with the understanding that we've got governance and international markets, right, that are going to be pressuring these two questions, there's some intersection here where we can start thinking about things like climate smart agriculture and planetary health, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I want to start by kind of going through each of these questions individually and giving you a brief taste of the kinds of things that we're interested in. Sorry, my mouse is all over the place here. And this first topic, right, is what are the impacts of climate change on food security? And so this is an old cartoon, but it's one that I start off my courses with because it's still so, it's kind of a great way to just broadly represent everything we're concerned about here. And you'll see this is kind of separated into possible benefits and drawbacks, but what's important to note is that these things are not divorced from one another, and it's not a binary. All of these things are happening at once. So it makes the situation a lot more complicated to figure out what wins out and where. So some possible benefits. Yes, plants like carbon dioxide. Higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could fuel what we call these fertilization effects, right? It could enhance growth. It could enhance growth of crops, but there are some caveats which we'll note in just a second. Secondly, as the climate starts to warm, we might experience longer growing seasons. For those of you that live around here, right, in the Northeast, I think maybe many of you do, right, you might even experience that viscerally over your time growing up and thinking about the beginning and end of the winter season, for example. And so that might allow for more crops to be grown within a particular season. And in some cases, some areas might get increased rainfall, but of course, that example at the beginning of the talk, right, can kind of point to issues with that. And all of these things could be used to advantage, but as we said, these drawbacks are also happening alongside. So what are these drawbacks? These are things you probably can visualize in your head, right, when you think about this: droughts, right, water deficits, air pollution, which accompanies greenhouse gas emissions in large form, but doesn't have to. Things like tailpipe emissions, right, ozone, can really impact crops. Climate change can bring the widespread prevalence or increasing prevalence of pests and diseases, heat stress. Carbon dioxide fertilization could help, but it's kind of like having a bunch of sugar and no protein to go with it. You can't just have CO2 in order to grow plants or crops. You also need nutrients like nitrogen, right? So if you're nutrient deficient, you're not going to see those benefits. In addition to having longer growing seasons, those growing seasons are hotter on average. And that can actually lead to a lot of crop issues. For example, crops can develop kind of a form of scoliosis, if you will. They grow too fast and they don't grow in the right ways, and suddenly they don't become, they become difficult to harvest. So these faster growing periods can also be an issue. And then of course, increased flooding, as we saw in that example, soil salinization, et cetera. And so when we take this compendium of potential impacts, some maybe benefit, a lot of drawbacks, and we put them together, we get a picture that looks like this, right? What are the impacts of climate change on crop production globally? And so what you're looking at here is kind of this composite image, taking a bunch of different estimates from different projections and models and ways that we look at what future impacts might be. And what you're looking at here are kind of these percent changes in yield, just the production side between now and 2050. I wouldn't put too much stock into these actual numbers. I think the colors are more important here. We expect, you know, across the lower latitudes and some of the mid latitudes, crop losses, right, in the reds. And yeah, there are some places that kind of show up as green, but there's a lot baked into this image, and a lot of it relies on adequate adaptation options. And it's not quite clear that everywhere will have access to those options. So you can kind of think of these green areas as potential, but not necessarily exactly what will happen. This is not a prediction. This is just a bracket on what the changes might be that we might expect moving forward. And so this kind of global picture belies a lot more uncertainty on the ground in different regions. And we'll talk about what that might look like in just a second. But the overall takeaway message from this is that, yes, we do not expect climate change, despite some of the benefits, to be an improvement on agriculture. We expect climate change to challenge agriculture for a number of reasons. Now, we want to talk, this is a very global picture. I think it's important to kind of contextualize this, right? This is really abstract, right? You can't really, what does this mean for a particular crop grown across a part of Africa or a part of South Asia or Latin America, right? What does this mean? That's a question that we've been trying to delve into a little bit more. This is a scary visualization. I just want to point you to a few things here that will be of interest. And so this is a project I've been on for the last roughly a decade, called the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. And our goal is really to understand, not at necessarily the global level, although we do work on that too, but at the regional level, right? Drilling down into particular districts around the world, what might the impacts of climate be? And importantly, how can we adapt to those? And so to do that, we've brought together experts across many fields. So I represent the climate space, but we also have people that work in the ag space, the social sciences and economic space. We have people that focus on different components of the agricultural system. So this is very much an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary project. And what we try to do is kind of what you're seeing on the right-hand side here, are two different things. One, we try to develop the tools that we're going to need in order to project future changes to agriculture. And that's kind of what our track one is doing, right? How do we actually trust the tools that we're using? That's a big question in the climate and agricultural sciences. And then once we do develop a trust of those tools in this track one, this track two is kind of where it's at. This is kind of our bread and butter, right? No puns intended. We're taking these future climate scenarios and we're saying, okay, how does this impact crops at the local level? And then we're working with stakeholders to say, okay, well, in that case, if a crop impact is, going to look negative, how do we develop adaptation strategies? Farmers are not going to sit back and let their crops rot in the field. They're going to try to save them if they can in some way. And so our mission is to provide some science to help inform what those adaptations look like. And so I want to walk through an example from the last few years of our work in a district, an area called Nakai, Zimbabwe. And we worked in about 10 sites across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, many different countries, very different contexts. And what was interesting about it is that it gave us a chance to look at what the common vulnerabilities are, but also to really understand how different these different systems are and how the wealth of adaptation strategies and the wealth of creativity and thought processes behind how do we adapt, right? How do we actually adjust to these changing conditions? And so in Zimbabwe, in this particular district, there was a mix of crop and animal activities that are fairly integrated. So farmers are kind of stratified. So there's, like in any other place, there's wealthier farmers and farmers that maybe don't have as much access to resources. These farmers were often planting crops, using them as fodder for animals, and then the animals were providing milk and kind of these added value products. Nearly all the farmers cultivate maize, corn, about a third produce groundnuts, and then a third small grains, millets, maybe sorghum. So that's kind of the context that we were working in. When we look at what the future climate change projections are in this region, you can see they're pretty coarse, right? Meaning you kind of see these grid boxes, they're quite vague. That's a limitation. We can talk about that later. But overall, we expect that this particular area in Zimbabwe, it will increase in temperature, just like most places on Earth, so experience of warming. And in this case, what we saw in the browns here is just a decline in rainfall. Now, when we actually start to open this book a little bit wider, what you see is actually there's a lot of variability in the rainfall. So overall, it's a decline, but you can have really rapid swings from season to season. But these are the kinds of conditions that we're anticipating. Okay, so that's our climate part. Then we go down into our crop part and we link those climate projections with the crop modeling results. And what we find for the main crops and products is something like the following. So one thing you'll see really before we actually talk about the numbers here is this hot, dry, hot, wet. What this means is that there's uncertainty, right? If we take one, if you go to one doctor, for a medical examination, and they give you one diagnosis and you find that diagnosis a little bit concerning, you'll likely go to another doctor for a second opinion, right? And so what we did is we got 29 second opinions. So in other words, there were 29 climate models that were used to make this projection. And those models, even though they averaged to look like this, some were a bit wetter and some were actually a bit drier. So we said, you know what, we don't want to just take that one average, because we need to give decision makers a range, right? Like it could be this bad or it could be this bad, or just to work with. And it turns out that when you factor in not just one model, but the range, you actually get some pretty big differences. So for the driest models, maize could decline by 25%. But under slightly wet conditions, you get the wetting offsetting some of the heat, which means maybe not much change. So that's a big difference for a decision maker who's sitting there saying, well, should I just ditch maize and not grow it? Or should I actually stick with it? This is the kind of decisions, right, that you're confronted with. And so maize did the worst. Groundnuts actually had a pretty big boost, even though you see a big decline there, and everything else was kind of on the red end of the spectrum. But the groundnut result was really interesting because the 18% is almost, there's almost no difference between that. So we said, okay, groundnut could actually be part of the solution here. So one thing to mention here before I talk about that is that in just the same way that we don't want to use just one doctor's opinion, right, one climate model because of this range of results, we also know that there are different ways that a country can sort of develop, right? They could follow a sustainable development trajectory, or they could follow something more fossil fuel oriented, which is what we did here in the United States. And so we said, before we start looking at how many farmers are vulnerable to climate change, let's actually develop with people in country, so working with the local ministries there, the in-country, the federal ministries, let's develop two trajectories, a green road of sustainable development and what we're calling the gray road, which is a bit more fossil fuel oriented, and see how these particular climate crop impacts could impact farmers. And what we found in general is that sustainable development trajectories reduced vulnerability as compared to fossil fuel driven trajectories. And under sustainable development, adaptation became easier for a lot of farmers. And so I'm not going to go through all the numbers here, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of narratives, right, that we're exploring to help decision makers situate, right, their potential options. But I want to come back to this groundnut thing because there are a few important lessons that emerge from this. So when we saw that the groundnut could actually do a little bit better than the other parts of the cropping system, we said, Well, that's something that we can capitalize on. So let's create an adaptation strategy. The first step in this adaptation strategy would be to start promoting and intensifying drought-tolerant crops, including maize, but also sorghum. The reason for this is because these farmers are already growing maize and sorghum, so we can leverage what they already know and introduce some drought-tolerant varieties and help kind of boost income a little bit that way. And that's kind of what you're seeing here is the absolute net farm returns. So you can see them increasing. And of course, this is kind of a proxy for how wealthy a particular farming household is. The more animals, the more wealth. Now, in the second step, we say, now that you've got some higher returns from the drought tolerant crops, let's actually start weaving in the legumes, the ground nuts. There was actually another legume down there in Kona that was being grown and developed by a local crop improvement organization there. So we said, let's actually start to weave in the legumes. Now, the legumes are important because they're nitrogen fixing and they can help boost soil fertility, right? Which is really important in this region and overall, it's really important. Once the legumes and ground nuts are in place, we can actually start vertically integrating and introducing markets for those particular crops so people could diversify either away from the animal agriculture or have this more robust income source via this crop, these groundnuts on the ground. And so it's a multi-step process that gets you to a diversified, more resilient, climate-smart cropping system. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me from this project was that, you know, we think about green revolution, right? These, like, what is development? What is agricultural development, right? And how is it that so much of these kind of Western or industrialized ideas of crop production made their way elsewhere? I'm not going to spend a whole conversation talking about that and or promoting it or villainizing it. But what I will say is that cropping system transitions really need local resources, local know-how, local knowledge, and they need to capitalize on what farmers are already doing. There is so much wealth of just knowledge and know-how. And this particular exercise really introduced us and taught us that and showed us that you could actually make really substantial gains by leveraging what's already within these communities. And so that's important. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information to throw at you, and that kind of represents one half of my work, right? Looking at climate impacts on crops and adaptation. I want to pivot now to the other side of things before weaving them together. And this is the environmental impacts of agriculture. And so this is going to take a step back, right? We're not looking at the local scale anymore, but we're taking a step back to the global, far back as possible to the global scale. And so what you're looking at here is the land that we occupy, right? We farm about over 40% of the Earth's surface, higher if you exclude the ice areas or areas that are marginal. We cover a good portion of the Earth, both for our croplands and for the way that we use animals in our systems as well. So we have a really big footprint. This has resulted, aside from just land conversion, deforestation, and those things, this has resulted in a host of other impacts. So let's take water, for example. What you're looking at here, particularly in the yellow, orange, and red, are stressed aquifers, right? So we're irrigating profusely, and now we're also irrigating with water that's been fossilized, right? Groundwater stores, which don't really make it into the surface environment very quickly. We're extracting that. And so many of our major aquifers that serve our major bread baskets are now stressed. And so this number here just shows the degree of stress. The red is the most. We use about 70% globally of our freshwater withdrawals for agriculture. In places like South Asia or parts of China, that gets above 90% goes towards agriculture. In addition, all of this intensive farming and deforestation and land use land cover change has resulted in soil degradation, and desertification is a bit more of a complicated idea, but we're losing soil fertility. And that's pretty much writ large to different levels. but most agricultural soils have some either moderate, in other cases, very high degrees of soil fertility loss. We also have really divergent nutrient applications and uses globally. In some areas, in the dark green, what you're looking at is synthetic nitrogen application. We use far too much. We're losing half of it into our oceans and waterways, causing dead zones. In other areas, right, which kind of mirror those yield gaps, we're maybe not using enough, or we've lost soil fertility such that those nutrients aren't being cycled back into the system, right? So not only are we using too much, we're not distributing it equitably across the planet. And so what this has led people like me, people that are coming from the environmental space, to conclude, right, over these last several decades, is that agriculture is now a major driver of ecosystem change on the planet. Agriculture accounts for about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's about as much as the power sector. And more, those two combined are the overwhelming majority of global greenhouse gas emissions. 60% of methane and nitrous oxide is fueled through agriculture. It is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. It is the biggest user of land and water. And what you're looking at here is just I'm not actually, I have a love-hate relationship with this plot, but it's called the Planetary Boundaries. And anything that's in the green, we're kind of within the safe operating space for each of these sectors. Anything that's in the yellow, we're in a band of uncertainty. You could argue climate change should actually be in the red here. The red is this high risk, right? So we've now, for this particular problem, exceeded our risk space. The black dots that you're seeing on top here is the role of agriculture. So you can kind of see here, when it comes to biodiversity and genetic diversity, how much of this wedge, right, of that risk space agriculture is eating up, is taking up. And it's quite a bit, massive driver of change. Now, I think what's interesting about this, other than sort of, in addition to being horrifying, is that, agriculture in the last, I would say, well, definitely since the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, but even before that, is being leveraged to say, well, agriculture can be a force for good, right? We can store carbon in our soils, we can build soil fertility. So despite the fact that it's accounting for this much damage, it's also now being asked to serve as a carbon sink, right? To decrease those environmental impacts and become a force for good. So it's just being pulled in a lot of different places. And we're looking to it as a solution space when currently it stands as part of the problem. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but I just wanted to flag that, I'm affiliated with NASA still. I work with the climate models there. I did my postdoctoral work there. And so one of my roles at NASA is to better incorporate agriculture into the models that we use to project future climate. So when you read the news and you see, our current global climate projections suggest that we're going to warm by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius if we don't do anything. Where do those projections come from, right? They come from models largely, and those models to date haven't really included all of these roles of agriculture in the environment. So the greenhouse gas emissions are there, but some of the other impacts related to irrigation, related to nutrient use, those are largely missing. And so my role is to help put those in, fill those details in. And so this is just a quick study I wanted to highlight to show how important this is. We were playing around with irrigation and we said, okay, let's actually just put irrigation into the land surface, the climate model, and see what it does. And so that's kind of what we've represented here. What you're looking at is the actual model input itself, right? We're telling the model there's irrigation in all of these blue dots, these blue cells. And when we do that, we find a lot of impacts everywhere, but the most interesting was actually in South Asia, a region where my family is from, and I have a particular interest in. And one of the things that we saw, which was interesting, is that irrigation, and I'll just kind of walk you through this quickly, it tends to cool the land surface. So that's what you're seeing in the blue. And that kind of makes sense, right? Anywhere you go by a lake or if you go by the ocean, it tends to be a bit cooler. And so that's what irrigation does. And this is a really heavily irrigated area in the northwestern Indo-Gangetic Basin, of rice wheat cropping systems, mostly in this location. So that wasn't a surprise because water cools the surface. But what was a surprise was this. What you're looking at here is sort of the moisture that's hanging out over the continent. And so South Asia is characterized by this monsoon system, which is really romantic, right? Like every summer, June, July, August, September, these winds sweep across the Arabian Sea. They carry a lot of water and they dump that water, and you get this monsoon rainfall that everyone seems to just, kind of fantasize about it. That whole system, we actually found irrigation weakens it. Because it cools the land surface, it actually prevents the land surface from heating up during the spring. And what happens to warm air? It rises, right? And when warm air rises, it sucks in air, in this case, from the Arabian Sea. And that's the air that brings the moisture. So if you cool the land surface, the air doesn't rise and you don't get any of this suction of the air onto the continent. And what winds up happening is that you increase rainfall here, but you actually reduce it across much of peninsular India and the subcontinent. In addition, you actually see irrigation reduces the surface air temperature. And so here, this red line is without irrigation. This blue line just shows the temperature over time with irrigation. And over India, you actually see it reverses, in fact. And so irrigation has this really amazing role, not just in South Asia, elsewhere, but particularly in South Asia, that we're trying to understand a bit more, right? And something that's unanticipated, that this is not the intent of irrigation, right? And so we're also looking at soil degradation. We're also looking at cropping systems. We're trying to put all of this stuff into the model to just see what difference it makes. But let's see, how am I doing on time here? Okay, so I'm about 1:40, so I've got just a few more minutes I want to spend before taking questions, because I'm sure you have a lot, and I'm going through a lot of information here. I want to present a new project that we're working on that were actually some of the images I think that were up on the website. And that's looking at, this is the solution space, right? How do we come up with agricultural systems that have less of a footprint locally, regionally, but that are still nourishing, right? How do we come up with climate smart agricultural systems, right? So this is increasing productivity, sustaining productivity, also incomes, adapting to climate change, and also mitigating climate change, right? And how do we evaluate them? Well, we've decided to look at this question, right, of climate smart agricultural systems in several areas, actually, starting with South Asia and starting with rice. Rice is actually a really big emitter. Rice paddies, flooded rice paddy production produces a ton of methane, about 10% of methane emissions from agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And it can just be very water heavy, right? It uses a lot of water. But rice is a staple crop, and we can talk about its merits. However, rice, unlike, for example, soy or maize, actually directly feeds people, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So we need a way to improve rice production that's less detrimental to the environment. All right, and so here we're looking at India specifically. Agriculture accounts for 90% of India's freshwater withdrawals. Rice is a big portion of that, and rice is a big emitter. So how do we apply climate smart principles to rice? Well, it turns out there is actually an old management system. It's been around for a long time, but it's gaining a lot of popularity now with this push towards responsible agricultural systems. It's called SRI, or the System of Rice Intensification. So what SRI is, it's not a seed package. There's no chemicals. It's a set of management principles. And the idea is you transplant rice quickly when it's really young in the ground. You space it wide enough so its roots can develop well. You restore soil organic matter through organic treatments. And importantly, you don't flood the paddy. There's a little bit of flooding when you plant the rice, but then you just let the plant draw that water down, and then you just wet the soil again once the soil becomes dry. So you're not flooding the paddy as much anymore. And that reduces the methane emissions. And the idea behind this is that the enhanced root structure allows the crop to grow. it therefore can be adaptive, like it's more resilient to climate change, and you're mitigating by reducing the flooding. And in fact, this project was covered on NPR a couple of years ago. I was like, you always know you make it as a scientist when it's on NPR. And so that's, so you can take, I can send that link through. That was kind of fun. We're still working on it though. But there are some big outstanding uncertainties here. Yes, this system, SRI, results in higher yields, but there's actually a lot of uncertainties in labor. It can be a little bit more labor intensive, at least initially. And sometimes in some places where women are the most responsible for agricultural labor, this can actually have a little bit of a social, gender equity issue. So it's something that we're trying to understand more. Because of the labor issues, farmers can disadopt it. So meaning they'll take it up for a little bit, but then they'll maybe ditch it and go back to conventional systems later on. And we have to figure out that dynamic. Yes, the system does mitigate methane, but there are trade-offs with other greenhouse gases that I won't get into here, but I'm happy to talk about it. And then lastly, in order for agriculture to be relevant to climate mitigation, you need these practices to be adopted at scale. If just one farmer is doing it, that's great, but it's not going to have a climate, it's not going to mitigate climate change. You need all farmers to adopt it, or at least a really big portion of them. And just what you're looking at here, this is a video. I don't know if you can actually hear the audio, but that doesn't matter. This is actually a video of some of the labor that's involved. Like when you flood the paddy, like why are paddies flooded? It's not because the rice needs to be flooded. Paddies are flooded because of weed control. So rice doesn't, a lot of rice doesn't actually need to be flooded. It can just tolerate it. And then if you suppress the weeds by flooding the paddy, that eliminates your labor. The problem with SRI is that you no longer have that flooding. And so you need to have some weed control. And so this is what's called a Kona Weeder. And what he's doing here is pushing that through the paddy, and it's got little spikes on it. So it disrupts the root system, because once you cut the roots a little bit, it can actually spur more tillers and more rice can grow. But it is quite a labor intensive process. Okay, so we are launching a project right now to basically look across all of these dimensions in India: productivity, adaptation, mitigation, and kind of look at the trade-offs to see who would adopt and who wouldn't, and make recommendations on how to scale this particular project, which is quite exciting. And so these are just pictures from a few field sites. These are high altitude field sites in mountain regions, and then low altitude valley regions. These farmers are much bigger tracts of land, much kind of wealthier farms. These farmers tend to be smaller scale and sharing smaller plots of land. In fact, we were here, and they had actually, as soon as we arrived at the field site, one of the farmers was just looking really harried, and we said, oh, you know, what's going on? What's wrong? And he was just really upset because they get a lot of elephants here, and elephants are really big pests, I guess, of rice plots. So they were just shooing away elephants, and there's like lookouts for elephants all over the place. And I was like, you know, I've heard of aphids and beetles and borers. Elephants as a pest is kind of an intriguing romantic idea in a lot of ways. But these are the kinds of environments that we're working in. I should also mention that this method is actually also present in Vietnam, Peru, and Colombia. And so we actually have sister projects going on to evaluate this method across countries. Okay, I know I'm running close to time. I just want to quickly introduce a broader concept for the future of ag. The future of food. And that is in early 2019, the public health community, interestingly, so not climate and not ag, but public health, introduced a concept called planetary health. And that is, they recognized that ag, of course, is important to food security, but food security is not being served everywhere. And on top of that, agriculture has all these environmental impacts. So what concept do we need to actually move towards beyond what we've done to help get us to this new, better way of operating? And they came up with this idea of planetary health, which is to nourish more people by reversing both ecological and climate damages. We need to do both. And so there's a lot of information that went into this report. I think what the interesting thing is that they looked across 3 dimensions, so production, food waste, and diet. And what you're looking at here are these planetary boundary components. Again, anywhere that's in the red is not good. Anywhere that's in the yellow is kind of not great, uncertainty. Anywhere that's in the green is like, okay, we have a solution. And one of the things that you see just looking down this, and I've highlighted the bottom, is the only place where you get cleanly out of the red across every category is when you combine improved production with reduced waste with dietary shift. All of those things need to happen together in order to get us into a reasonable, safe operating space where we've got healthy systems that don't damage the planet. And so this is my last slide. This is a really powerful concept. And I was so psyched when it came out in 2019 because it was like, okay, this is what is going to kind of unify these disparate researchers who are working across sectors that are not talking to each other, that need to talk to each other, right, about how to devise the future of food, right? And so out of this comes several broad conclusions. One, yes, growing more crops on the land that we have is important, but that's not a silver bullet. We need to also be looking at not just intensifying, but redefining our relationship with food and the areas that we grow it. We need to explore a whole bunch of options, not just on the production side, but also on sort of the policy and economic side. We need to provide incentives for adopting different agricultural systems and eating differently. We also need to have taxes as well too. We kind of need both. We need to rethink our subsidies and figure out what is important to support and what does it serve, right? Think back to those first diagrams on calories to the food system versus yield gaps. We need to figure out food waste. It's just kind of an unacceptable problem in industrialized countries and in emerging economies where a lot of food is lost even before it exits the farm gate. We need to really think about how to provide farmers with the help that they need. We need to rebalance our approach to animal product consumption. Some people don't like to hear this. Food is very personal, so I completely understand that this sets off alarm bells, but it's not going to happen. We need everything. And so reducing our consumption of animal products is just, at this point, it's just a quantitative fact that needs to be part of the solution space. And then we also need to rethink trade. We need to rethink the way that we source our food. And that has a lot of issues surrounding it. But the beauty is that, yes, it would be great to adopt full diets, right, that are nutritious and don't rely on animal ag, and that's fine. But we don't have to be that drastic, right? There are even just slight tweaks, and that's kind of this last graph, which, this British researcher did this great thing. He kind of saw the British cycling team, and he was like, oh, they have this theory of training that's based upon marginal gains, like just gaining a little bit in strategic locations can actually add up to winning a race. And so he kind of took this idea and applied it to food. And so just small percentage reductions in shifting diets and reducing losses and improving efficiency can actually add up to a lot at the end. And so I think that last take-home message is, unlike changing a light bulb, which is great for your values, but that's not quite the action that's needed to curb climate change in the power sector right now. We need much larger action than that. Deciding what you eat 3 times a day has an impact. It has way more of an impact at this point than the energy usage you necessarily choose at home, although that has merits as well too, so I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. But what you eat matters. That decision space matters. And so thinking about that personally and then writ large, right, how that factors into ag policy moving forward is going to be an important conversation that we'll have as we embrace kind of this next period of our future, both nationally and internationally. And so with that, this is a picture from my farm. This is actually the view I'm looking at right now, upstate, where we are actually in the process of wilding it instead of farming it, although we'll have some permaculture going in soon. But I want to say thank you to the Broadway Green Alliance and to all of you for listening to, I'm sure, what was a lot of information being thrown at you. So thank you for your attention and for listening.
Thank you so much for that incredibly rich and in-depth presentation. I'm sure everyone here has learned a lot. I see we have some questions and
Sure.
And some great comments that were put into the chat. Susan, I'm going to jump to you first. You want to ask your question? It's a great one. You are muted.
Which question? I can't remember now.
Oh, just this last one that you asked. Great takeaway answer.
Yeah, it wasn't a question. It was really much more of a statement. It's just I thought, we're always kind of saying to people or hearing from people, but what can I do? I'm just one person. And I kind of love having this as a first answer because it's so tangible. And it's one of the things the BGA tries to do is come up with tangible, small steps people can do. And that's a great one. So I appreciate hearing it that way. And I think that's something we can do to amplify to our own people. That's a step everybody really could take.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Charlie, I see your hand up, and then I want to jump to Mark.
Thanks very much for that presentation. Obviously, a lot in there. One topic you mentioned was the desire to use use agricultural or agricultural related investments as offsets and other projects. Obviously, the first offsets were tree planting, and we're aware of the issues that go with that. There are a lot of offsets being proposed to use more efficient wood stoves to create lower demands. I'm curious as to on a non-personal basis, on an offset basis, what you consider the best state-of-the-art projects or offset opportunities out there based on your research?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I think offsets is tough, right? Because what an offset demands is that and you have pretty well quantified what the emissions are of an agricultural system, right? So in order to offset things, right, I need to invest a certain amount, knowing that that's going to actually result in a reduction of emissions, right, or an uptake of carbon or something like that. The problem with agriculture at this point is that it's not a point source in the way that, like a power generation source is. And so despite a lot of calls that you might be hearing about regenerative agriculture, which I think is great, and we can talk about that, I would have a hard time telling you, however, that any offset that you're investing in for ag to build soil carbon or something for that, I would have a hard time telling you exactly how much you're offsetting on that front, because it is so difficult to quantify, because there are so many different components of the land surface to consider when you're doing that. Planting a tree is obvious because it's kind of a unit, and you kind of understand how much carbon it uptakes. But when you start thinking about things like building soil fertility through improved animal management, for example, there are trade-offs with different greenhouse gases. It's not just the carbon that you're putting in the soil, it's the methane, obviously, that's coming out of the animal, it's the processing, it's all of these things, and adding that up is really difficult. So what I would say right now, I know this is not a great response to your question, is that I think it's great. I am a little bit wary about the idea that we can use agriculture to offset climate change. We can use agriculture. We have to develop better management practices to build soil fertility, improve, put carbon back into the ground, diversify those systems for farmers, because that will decrease the environmental impact, that we know, and it will make the agricultural systems more resilient. But if you want to buy and sell offsets for ag to function as mitigation, right, the way that kind of buying trees and that sort of thing does, I don't think we're quite there yet everywhere to be able to recommend that. Maybe we are in Hudson Valley, maybe we are in some particular farm in Montana, but we're not at that stage everywhere. So I think for now, what we really, and that's all to say that it's not that it's not possible, we need better data. We need to get ag to the state where energy is, where we can really understand what's going in and out of these systems from a greenhouse gas perspective and what the other trade-offs are. And so there's nothing wrong with building soil carbon. Absolutely not. I think it's great. But the degree of the claims of how much agriculture can take up is subject to a lot of uncertainty right now. So I think thinking about it in terms of offsets at this point in time is, it's going in the right direction, but we're not there yet.
Just quick follow-up. The things that I've found most promising are agricultural adjacent, like methane digesters on dairy farms and other things that take a piece of the puzzle and for eliminate methane to the atmosphere. Those are
yeah, and that's great. And I think, you know, to do that, like you'd also have to, I mean, what I would want to see, and this varies between operations. Some operations are probably great at this, but, you know, my questions would be, okay, well, how does the methane from the animal, right, and kind of the digesters that they're using to offset that, how does that compare to the amount of feed, the water use, right, everything else that goes into that supply chain? And I think like, I don't know, right? It depends on the actual company, the system, right? How much of an offset that digester is compared to the entire life cycle of that particular animal. And then of course, against what? Like, would it be more useful to go towards that animal and just digesting kind of like, you know, the waste that comes out of that system? Or would it have been better instead of to use that amount of feed and water for the dairy, for the animal, to just feed people with it, right? Like what is the best use of resource, right? It's kind of, that's what makes it complicated, right? But I agree, yeah, you know, if we're gonna have dairy, right, it makes sense to at least manage the waste in that way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mark, I want to thank you for a lot of comments you put in here. Do you want to go ahead with this question about carbon wrenching?
Yeah. I was working as ideas and engineering at the City of Thousand Oaks wastewater treatment plant, and we were concerned about, this is in California, so we're concerned about water in general. And I noticed, I was already aware of carbon wrenching, and I noticed that when you use carbon wrenching to pump carbon into the soil, it percolates. Rainfall percolates a lot better. You don't wind up with the, and so it's a big water thing, which actually plays better in California, in places that are dry all summer, than even the climate change thing. And I actually tried to get our city government to do this campaign where we did carbon ranching in schools and parks and stuff. And by the way, you would mow the grass less often, so you save some money there. But it didn't get anywhere because, you know, I didn't have a horticulturist and a bunch of other people to say, yeah, that'll work. But the main question is, have you heard of anybody pushing carbon ranching on urban landscapes, and why not?
Yeah, on urban landscapes.
Well,
yeah,
as an education thing.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think, so and to clarify, you know, my farm's about an hour and a half upstate. We're not quite urban, really at all here, but in the city. So, you know, in an urban landscape from an educational perspective, you know, so there's been a proliferation, of course, of urban farms, right, and that sort of thing. In New York City, right, there are a lot of rooftop farms, so that's not quite the same thing. But interestingly enough, to echo your point, those rooftop farms actually, I'm thinking about like Brooklyn Grange and stuff, they actually, they were financed to start not from a food production perspective, but because the soils will collect stormwater. So that was actually an interesting interplay between, so it's stormwater management that funded them. Yeah, you know, I think that there is a discussion. I'm trying to think of like hard examples that I can point to, even within the city. Governor's Island comes to mind, actually, of demonstration plots for this kind of, I don't know that they're calling it carbon farming, but the intent is still there. So cover crops, diversification, right? Keeping crops in the ground, developing root systems, which is all the same kind of thing, right? That's kind of, you know, fueling into that idea. So I think there's a lot of like demos going on to see how that can actually help to either retain water, green spaces in the city. I think people have been talking about them very much insofar as like water regulation and control. So I do think that you're going to be seeing an emergence of these things, and I could point to projects that are not specifically called carbon ranching, but are doing something very similar within the city. And so, look, I think that this is just a way of the future. Like, it makes sense to build soil fertility for all the reasons. And I'm so glad you said what you said, because we actually have a paper we're working on right now to look at the drought mitigation that you could get from building carbon stocks within soils, right? Instead of the climate angle, the water angle. So this is something we're actively working on. I think that, particularly with incoming policies, hopefully this is, carbon farming, right? Maybe not from a climate mitigation standpoint, but from an environmental ecosystem services standpoint, it just makes good sense. And, to that end, people have been, no-till has been around for a long time in the US. Unfortunately, it's accompanied with some not so great externalities like our increased herbicide use. But I do think that what you're talking about is, if you haven't seen it yet, it's there. It's just not being called that, and it will be increasingly called that, and that will increasingly be done in the future. It's just a no-brainer. It's just that you need to structure incentives in order to do it. So yeah, I think it's great. I think it's important. I think you're going to find examples of that. It's just a matter of how to align that with some of the incentives for practice. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am aware of the time. We've gone a little over, so thank you all for sticking with us today. And a huge, huge thank you to you, Sonali, for this incredible presentation that has left us with lots to think about. So thank you so much.
Great.
With that, I will lead us out. We are back on February 11th. This is going to be an in-depth session on our reduce, reuse, reopen sustainable practices for reopening theater. So please come back and join us for that. We will be so excited to see you there. And a big thank you again to you, Sonali. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, thank you so much. Take care.